Welcome to another episode of the Plutus Awards Podcast. Our community is filled with hundreds of stories from creators and entrepreneurs just like you. And through this show, we share these stories of challenges and successes, from bloggers to podcasters to writers, speakers, and more. Today's guest is Doc G, and he's the host of the Earn and Invest podcast, where he has next-level personal finance conversations with panels of community members and experts. In this episode, we talk about his journey from launching What's Up Next with his co-host, his mindset when he struck out on his own, and why, in his words, was intentional in forming a new partnership to make the best show possible. He goes into detail about both the logistics and mindset to make it all work. Let's dive right into my conversation with Doc G. Doc G, welcome to the show. Super excited to have a conversation with you today.
I'm so happy to talk with you, Sarah, and I am a big fan of the Plutus Foundation and Plutus Awards, so it's really cool to be on the podcast.
Excellent. And I'm sure that a lot of people are going to get some really wonderful insights from our conversation today. So let's start off with Diversify and then the What's Up Next podcast and why you decided to rebrand to Earn and Invest.
So I am a man of many brands. Back in, it must have been the end of 2017 when I started this journey about writing about personal finance. I actually wanted to call my blog Accidental Fire. And of course, there already is a great blog called Accidental Fire because I had come to the Financial Independence Retire Early community completely by accident. I had no idea that I was financially independent. And when I read a book and learned the vocabulary and realized that indeed is what I was, that's what I wanted to call my blog. That was taken. So I started to think about, well, what did I want to call my blog? And I eventually settled with Diversify. And the reason why I called it is obviously it's a play on the word diversify. But for me, I felt like I was an outsider in the financial independence community. I grew up in a middle to upper class family. I am a doctor, so I was a professional. I had a very high income. All of these things made me not the typical person who was out there talking about financial independence. The other thing is I had very little interest in talking about tactics. So whereas you go and you read these blogs that talk about how to pay off debt, or they talk about how to do a Roth conversion, or how to invest even, those were not the kind of things I wanted to talk about. I was much more into the mindset of financial independence. Why do we do what we do and how should we be thinking about it? So when I started the blog, Diversify made a lot of sense. I had been blogging for almost a year when Paul Thompson and I decided to start a podcast. And of course, whenever you start a new venture, you spend a lot of time thinking about, okay, what should the name be? And I made one critical error. I did one thing right, and then I also made one critical error. The thing I did right is the What's Up Next podcast was actually perfect for what we wanted. The idea was we were going to be having financial independence discussions or personal finance discussions, but they weren't going to be the 101. They weren't going to be the how-to. They were going to be more the 201 classes. So What's Up Next was to give us that idea that we were going to be having next level discussions about personal finance. And we were doing it with panels of community members. So it was a very different look at financial independence and personal finance. I continued with that brand back at the end of 2018, early 2019. Paul Thompson decided he didn't want to participate in the podcast anymore. We were branded as What's Up Next, and I started a strategic relationship with Joe Salsihai of Stacking Benjamins, and him and I started working on the podcast in general, trying to increase listenership and the downloads. And one thing that I had always known in the back of my mind, it only took a few months of having the What's Up Next podcast where I realized the problem with the name is that it didn't really tell people what it was. And so it was a great name for what we were doing, but you couldn't look at the charts or you couldn't be browsing through iTunes and figure out what we were about or what we were talking about. So I knew eventually I would have to change the name. And that's how we came up with Earn and Invest. Joe and I put our heads together and thought about it for literally a month. What name could we use that was simple, that got across what we were doing, and that was appropriate so that someone who was just seeing us on the charts would know who we are and know what we were about?
I love that. That's a great lesson right there, is the difference between creating a name or a brand based on what you're doing versus making it clear so that whoever comes to find you or searching for that topic knows exactly what you're about, right? That's a great lesson right there. Gosh, there's two directions we can go into in terms of this conversation. So let's talk about the partnership split or breakup, I guess, so to speak, in terms of what did the logistics look like when you and Paul Thompson decided you weren't going to be doing this podcast together anymore?
So Paul and I had set off to do this. And when we began, it was just really a lot of fun. And we brought very different things to the table. So I was much more the creative, big thinker. What are the episodes going to be? Who are we going to have on? And he was much more the technical guy. This is how we set it up. This is how we edit. This is the mic you need. So we really fit together very well. But he also was very busy running a real estate empire. I would definitely call it an empire at this point, where he was having masterminds and he was doing a lot of buying and selling. And I think at some point it just got to be too much work. We were at one point doing all our own in-house editing. So he came to me, and I think it was a very difficult conversation for him to have, because I do believe we both really enjoyed it and we were getting along very well. There weren't really major creative differences. But I think he just knew that his path wouldn't continue. And that was hard for me. One is that I had this partner in crime. So at least when I started the podcast, it was very much something him and I did together. And especially as it got a little more popular and we went to places like FinCon and we even won the Plutus Award, it was wonderful to do it with him. When he decided to leave, there was the emotional aspect of, okay, I always had this partner in crime and we would do panels sometimes of 3 or 4 guests. So it's really nice to have 2 people carrying some of that load of driving the conversation. I was losing that. But the other part is I was losing the guy who did everything technical with the podcast. I had no idea. I knew nothing about editing. You know, our podcast, we run it through Libsyn. I didn't know what Libsyn was. I didn't know anything. And I'm not a technophobe, but I'm not nearly as good at it, for instance, as he is. So that was a big transition for me, as he had to slowly hand over the tech to me, teach me how to do it. And I had to emotionally get comfortable with this idea that it would really have to be mine, which means I would have to be the driver of conversations. But also I'd have to decide how the look and the feel of the podcast would be. So whereas on one side, I was definitely mourning the transition, I also saw it as a chance to really make it me. And as I started working with Joe Saul-Sehy, he made it very clear to me something that I had never realized before, that people often will come to your podcast because of a guest or a conversation they're interested in, but they'll usually stay because of you. And I wasn't putting a lot of me into the episodes. I was by the guests I had. I was putting a lot of me by the conversations we were having, but that was it. So you had to really infer a lot about me based on the types of episodes we had. So this was a real chance to insert my personality into the podcast, how to make it mine, and I think hopefully how to make it much more richer for the community I was trying to build around the podcast.
Why do you think initially you weren't really inserting your personality or parts of yourself in the podcast?
You know, I don't think I knew to do that was part of it. Again, I was very much of, you really want to highlight the people you're having on as guests. And I still think that's true, but you as the host are kind of the backbone. You are the frame and structure. And the truth of the matter was, I was choosing these topics and having these guests through a very particular lens that was my viewpoint. I just wasn't explicitly saying it. So part of what I think was the plan to make the podcast a much more rich experience for those people who had really bought into it and like to listen to it is that I would be much more explicit about that lens and give much more background and color to why I was doing what I was doing.
Did you feel like that was something that you focused on more, or you didn't really realize that until you were essentially on your own?
I think it was an evolution. Paul and I were finding that we were happy with the quality of the episodes and we were getting lots of great feedback. On the other hand, we still weren't getting a huge amount of downloads. So we were really happy with the product, but also realizing that maybe we weren't having the effect that we could still have on the community. So that was the thought process going in. As Paul decided to leave What's Up Next, I had to make a decision. Was I going to take it all on my own? And if so, did I need a partner to help me do this? And I had been thinking about aligning with a bigger podcast just in the past anyway, because what I was really bad at was driving the downloads. But I think once people found out about the show, they really liked it and they stayed there. So Joe Salsihai at that time was posting a job for Stacking Benjamins. It was basically a part-time producer. And I really enjoyed producing What's Up Next. So I wrote him and said, hey, I'd be interested in this part-time producer job. I'm a physician, but I've been winding down my physician work and trying to really replace it with things that I have a passion for. And I really had a passion for producing podcasts. So I ended up interviewing with him. And at that time, Paul had just left. And I said, and if we're really not interested in this producer role, maybe the other possibility is we align podcasts. I'm much smaller, but I could certainly use your help. I feel like it adds something different to your community. And we started that conversation. And what it ended up being is really a creative collaboration where I work with him on Stacking Benjamins. I'm part of the collaborative process and part of his team that puts that together. But then he came in as a partner on What's Up Next, which eventually became Earn and Invest. And I think I was really lucky because him and I creatively see very similarly. We love the idea of reaching lots of people. We're interested in things like downloads, but the truth of the matter is what really gets both of us excited is making a really strong show. And so him and I really saw eye to eye on that. The upside for me is not only did I get some of the clout of the Stacking Benjamins podcast, I got a lot more visibility. I became more of a panelist on his episodes once a month. But the other thing is I got his amazing creative input. And in many ways, he taught me how to really take what I think I was good at, which was having good interviews. And he taught me how to build a podcast. And really, there's a lot to a podcast. Your interviews, your episodes, that middle part is really important, especially if you have guests. But the beginning is important and the end is important too. And I wasn't doing a really good job at the beginnings and endings. And so he really helped me and clarified who I wanted to be and what I wanted my episodes to sound like. And I think the quality has just gone up so much since I've gotten his input. I mean, Joe is really a pro. He knows podcasting back and forth, and he really is a student of it. So this is a guy who's constantly saying, how can I bring up my podcast game? And when you get surrounded by people like that, it really invigorates you to put some of the time and the energy into it.
Yeah. So this is a two-part question because you've been talking, Joe did all this stuff because of him, this, right? Number one is, what do you feel like you're bringing to the table to this relationship, this partnership? And number two, somebody might feel really intimidated approaching someone who they think is huge, right? Stacking Benjamins is huge. And so you were like, I made this strategic relationship with Joe. That's great. But if, let's say, someone were to do that, right? Something similar to what you do, what would you suggest?
So there are a few things. First and foremost, what do I bring to the relationship? Well, I think I am, to a lesser extent, a collaborative partner with Joe. So creatively, we work together. And in fact, I do sit in on his weekly meetings in Stacking Benjamin. I help him form some of the scripts. Although you don't actually get much of it on my podcast, comedy is part of what I'm interested in. So I help him write some of the more comedic parts of Stacking Benjamins. And so he gets someone who is interested and excited and willing to donate time to make Stacking Benjamins as good as it possibly could be. The truth is, we've also just developed a friendship. I mean, him and I can sit there and just wax philosophically about podcasting and entertaining. And again, I think we really come at it from the same angle of creating this very entertaining medium. Like him and I both really, more than anything, want to make good, amazing, deep shows. So I think I bring that to his team. I could see how you'd say, well, Stacking Benjamins is an incredibly successful podcast. What's Up Next at that time was fairly small. There were a few things that gave me the confidence to approach him. One is I had him as a guest on my podcast as a panelist. So I felt like we had that rapport and I felt like it was a really good episode. And on some level, he was impressed with the show. So that helped. The other was thanks to the Plutus Foundation and the Plutus Awards. We had run the Plutus Awards for Best New Personal Finance Podcast in 2019. So that also gave me a certain amount of credibility, even though I was a much smaller show, that I could approach him and suggest such things. The other thing is you really got to just cast your net. I've especially found that with getting guests. Is you have to just go after a lot of people. Some of them might be really successful. Some of them you might have to internet stalk or Instagram stalk or what have you. And maybe 99% of them will say no, but the 1 or 2% who do say yes can lead to really important things for you or your brand or your product. I felt confident enough that I could say, this is what I have. How can I make this relationship work? The other thing is, you try to think about what you can bring to a bigger brand. And so that's always part of the conversation is, well, Stacking Benjamins is really very, very strong on current events. It's very, very strong on the newest and the latest and the greatest. I could come to him and say, well, what's up next is really a much deeper dive into a single subject with 3 or 4 people. And so whereas I think Stacking Benjamins goes very wide, I could say, well, what's up next goes deep. And so that was part of the conversation too, is what can I add to your podcast? What can I add to your community that has value that you don't currently provide?
Love that. I think that's great. It's not in terms of like they're big and I'm small or anything. It's really everyone has something unique and valuable to bring to the table, whether it's a partnership or just a collaborative project. I am curious about the challenges in terms of your mindset, because I know you're talking about like, okay, well, I transitioned from partnering with Paul Thompson, and then I had to really carry the mental load by myself, and that was a bit of a challenge, kind of figuring that out. So, what would you say was the biggest challenge in that aspect of it?
Well, mindset for me is I had never done this before, and I had had success both in personal finance and actually in the medical blogosphere in writing. But on some level, I had never pictured myself as the person who could carry a brand to that next level. So a big part of coming to terms with being the sole voice on the podcast was reimagining myself as the guy who can be this, right? I am the guy who can have a successful podcast that has lots of people interested in it and that builds a community. That was a big mindset struggle for me, because I had always known that I could create things, but I never knew if I could sell them. So I was always felt really happy, especially with blog writing, with writing in general. I said, I can write something that touches people. I know I can do this. I've done it before. I love writing. I feel confident in that ability, but I never knew whether I could take it to the next step and actually sell it to people for mass consumption. And so for me, that was a big mindset shift, is I had to get around this idea that you can do this, that there may be some roadblocks, but that you actually are this person who can achieve this goal.
And what would you say has been the biggest challenge in terms of mindset now that you're partnering with Joe Saul-Sehy?
Wow, the biggest challenge since I'm partnering with him. I would say that the challenge continuously, always with a podcast, is one-upping yourself, creating a better and better and better project, and weathering the highs and lows. So, for instance, I partnered with Joe. This was in January of 2020. And I really felt like we were hitting this height where creatively the episodes were getting better, our downloads were going up, the community was growing, and then COVID hit. Immediately, I saw downloads go down. People just weren't as interested. The community wasn't as active. And so part of the struggle is always talking to yourself and saying, it is really a marathon. And you have to stop getting so worried about each individual sprint that makes it up. You get winded at times. COVID was a perfect example of, if you were right there on the edge of, should I continue my podcast or shouldn't I continue my podcast, and COVID hit, you are very likely to fall off that cliff just because it was one of those hard times. So I really try to remind myself that there are ups and downs. And when the ups go really high, remind yourself that often they go back down at some point, and that when they're really low, that you tend to get out of that valley and move back upwards again.
Can you tell me like a specific example of like a low that you're like, okay, now I got to talk myself back up?
Well, I will tell you, one of the things with Joe is every once in a while, we will do a postmortem on episodes. So we will listen to an episode I've done and he'll go through and say, okay, you could really change that, or this wasn't right, or et cetera. And each time I come out with homework, those sometimes are lows because it's just the challenge of saying, I'm already putting lots of time into this. I'm doing the best I can. But yet now I really have to find out a new way of doing things, fix and clean things up, and start again on some level. And so those are repeated lows sometimes, and they're good lows, right? You need those. You need to recognize what you don't do as well and struggle through fixing it to get to that place where then you feel things are better. I'll give you a perfect example. Joe and I were really working on our intros, and I didn't have a very compelling intro for what's up next. So we talked about really telling a story that was about me, that related to the guest who was coming on or the subject we were going to talk about. I got into this habit and I was really proud of it, of thinking about what I want to say. And then I would write it out. Often I would read it for the guests because I wanted them to hear the intro so they could also understand, where we were coming from. And there was a point where we were doing a postmortem and Joe was listening to this. He said, I can tell you're reading that. And he said, if you really want this to work, you really got to do it off the cuff. I remember how much discomfort that made me feel, because I'd always pictured myself a storyteller, but I'd always been a very rehearsed storyteller. So what he was saying is you need to throw that out. You're still going to have to do these intros. You're still going to have to come up with these compelling stories, but I want you to do it cold. And I like to do it in front of the guest because, again, I think it really adds to the podcast when they are invited into the story and they get to see how your mind's working before you even start. So I had a conundrum. I had to put myself out there and come up with a good story and tell it without messing it up or making it sound bad or making it feel bad for me. I mean, if you tell a bad story at the beginning of a show, you just cut it out, re-record it later and add it on. But I had the added pressure of being right there in front of my guests. That was one of those times where at first it was a low because I'm like, oh, now I was really happy and proud with how I was doing this, but he's right. It'll sound better if I change this. And I had to reorient. And that always brings a little bit of a low because you're like, you keep on wanting to get to finished, but there is no finished. Sometimes that takes a while to get used to.
What do you hope in the next, let's say, 5 years to come out of this partnership and future ones?
So the number one thing that I really want to ever get out of any of these partnerships is I want to create something I'm proud of. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. When I was a doctor and learned about personal finance and financial independence, one of the goals was to be financially independent and to be able to separate myself from my means of income and job. Once I got there, I had to decide what life would be about. What's going to bring me happiness? What is my goal whenever I go into anything? Because I'm a serial overachiever. That's how I became a doctor. That's what I've done with my whole life. And that was wonderful, but it wasn't necessarily always making me happy, because the problem with serial overachievement is once you get that achievement you think is going to make you happy, you're already starting to think about that next thing. You're already starting to get to that next level. So when you talk about the podcast in general, and certainly the collaboration, I'm trying to focus more on the here and now. So my goal is enjoy it while I'm doing it and to create something that stands by itself as worthwhile. I think that's really the ultimate goal of all of this, because I can keep on thinking about what I want to achieve. I want this many downloads, or I want this much advertising revenue, or I want to make this much money on the podcast. That stuff is all great, but it only makes you happy until you reach that goal, and then you're already pushing towards the next one. So I'm really trying to change how I look at doing things like podcasting. So I want to enjoy it while I'm doing it. I want to create something that's worthwhile. And then last but not least, I want to use it to connect to other people. So this partnership with Joe is great because it allows me to create a better podcast that does all this, but it also allows me to connect with him, this interesting, creative guy. And so I've already grown that way. But then I've also become part of his team. So then there's all these other people who I've got to know and hang out with. And then I'm a panelist on his show, on his Friday shows once a month. And then I get to hang out with those panelists. So there's these accrued experiences, which I think are just very worthwhile.
Awesome. So Doc G, where can everyone find you online?
So the best place to find me is earnandinvest.com. That is the web page for the podcast. Certainly you can listen to the Earn and Invest podcast on wherever you listen to podcasts, whether that be Apple or Stitcher or Spotify or now Amazon. Wherever you want, it should be there. I also wrote a blog called Diversify.com. I am not updating that blog as much because I'm transitioning it to Earn and Invest. So if you go to Diversify.com, you will get to see, a few hundred blog posts. But I am starting to transition that material towards Earn and Invest. So hopefully it all will be housed at Earn and Invest at some point.
Awesome. Again, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. It's been a blast.
Before we catch up with a previous Plutus Awards winner, let's take a look at some lessons we can learn from my conversation with Doc G. So the first lesson is create a clear brand. It's not about being creative. It's about being clear so that your audience knows exactly what your content is about and how they can benefit from it. I know that maybe we think we're very clear in what we're trying to do, or we're trying to think of a really clever name and it'll attract our audience members. But it's these types of assumptions and beliefs that can really muddle our message. So Earn and Invest is much clearer than what's up next. So as you're looking at your own website, podcast, book, whatever it is, take a look at the name, take a look at the description, even your elevator pitch to make sure that it is clear in terms of who your audience is, what your content is about, and what someone's going to get out of it. Lesson number 2 is that your mindset is just as important as the logistics when it comes to partnerships, right? Especially when you form the partnership and maybe even when it is over. And by this, I mean having agreements in place. So these can be formal written agreements that you draft with a lawyer. It could be just simple checklists that you have with your partner. And then as it grows, as you monetize whatever it is you're doing, you can be very clear in terms of the percentage that each partner gets in terms of the profit. Also, if you are leaving a partnership or forming new ones, it can be really difficult in terms of a mindset perspective because now you're on your own or you're not used to working with someone. And so it's really a lot of internal dialogues that you really need to have with yourself in order to really make this successful. So lesson number 3 is to be intentional with your partnerships. So think about what value you bring to the table. Let's say your partner is more established than you, maybe in a certain industry. You still have value to bring to the table. So for Doc G, even though he's partnering with Joe Saul-Sehy, for him, he brings a lot of value in terms of contributing ideas and things like that. Also, you want to think about what are your shared values and goals. So before even partnering up with someone, think about that. Are you both really interested in making the best content? Do you have the same goals in how you want to monetize or even how you want to structure the business? All right, so I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Now over to Harlan, founder and executive director of the Plutus Foundation.
We recently checked up on some of our previous Plutus Awards winners to find out what's been happening since their win. They called in to keep us in the loop. Here's Chris Mamula.
Hi, this is Chris Mamula. I'm one half of the team along with Derek Kirkpatrick, who writes the blog Can't Retire Yet. We won the 2019 Plutus Award for the Best Retirement Blog. The experience was, honestly, it was kind of a shock. I didn't really think we had any chance to win it, and it was pretty awesome. A lot of people came up, and I think it gave us a lot of credibility among our peers. Since we've won, we continue to write weekly on the site. In October, I released my first book. We decided to redesign the entire blog to give especially the reader, a better reader experience. And we also just started a partnership with a retirement calculator, which that's kind of been our claim to fame, I guess, is we've been known for really extensive retirement calculator reviews. And one of the ones which we found was the best is a very small, independently developed retirement calculator. And so we decided to partner with them. A lot of exciting things are happening for us, and we are honored to have won the Best Retirement Blog Award. And we're excited to keep going and helping people who are do-it-yourself planners to be able to do better for themselves as they figure things out. Thanks.
Thank you so much for listening to the Plutus Awards podcast. The Plutus Awards is a virtual event this year, and it's coming soon. So make sure you grab your free ticket at plutusawards.com.